before we understand the physiological processes of trees in the winter, we need to understand a little bit about what trees do in the summer. And to understand what trees do in the summer, we need to understand some really special properties of water on planet Earth. So here's a little tree with two hearts that have been carved into it, showing water's two big loves in life. Water loves water, and water loves surfaces. So let's consider, how do I go to the next slide?
You can just click on the slide kind of, yep, there you go. Yep.
Okay, so everybody's sort of sat in their car while it's raining and looked at the rain kind of hit the windshield when you're sort of waiting for a break in the rain so you can run inside. And I'm sure that you've noticed as you're looking at the windshield that when there's two little droplets of water on the windshield, there will be two little droplets of water sitting close to one another, and then they'll move laterally along the windshield as if they're attracted by magnets, and those two droplets of water will become one bigger droplet of water, right? Those molecules of water are so attracted to one another that they will move against, even sometimes against a height gradient to get closer to one another because they're so attracted to one another. So water molecules love other water molecules. They want to be touching other water molecules. That's why when water pours, it pours in drops that are circular. So all of those molecules are touching as many other water molecules as possible as they fall. Then the other thing is that water loves surfaces. So when we look at our windshield and we see those droplets of water as they fall down the windshield, you'll notice that they leave almost kind of a film of water on the surface of the windshield. That's because water, while it's really attracted to other molecules of water, it's also really attracted to non-water surfaces. So a small film of water gets left on that windshield as the droplet falls down because those water molecules that are right up against the surface really want to stay up against the surface. Is this all making sense? Unmute yourself if you're not with me. Okay, great. So water molecules love water molecules. And water molecules love surfaces. Water molecules being attracted to other water molecules is called cohesion. Water molecules being attracted to surfaces, wanting to touch up against a surface, is called adhesion. Those two properties of water together makes what's called capillary action. So if we've got a really, really small diameter tube, and we put that small diameter tube into a cup of water, some of those water molecules will be attracted to the surface that's inside of our small tube, and they'll start climbing up that surface. And then because those water molecules are also very attracted to other water molecules, the water molecules behind them will follow. And then they'll be attracted to the surface a little bit higher up. The other ones will follow. They'll be attracted to the surface a little higher up. The other ones will follow. And water can climb up a tube very high, well, comparatively very high, just from the attraction that those water molecules have to each other and to the surface of the inside of the tube. That's capillary action, okay? So trees are these amazing beings on Earth that really exist only because they've sort of figured out, right? They're not sentient. Through millions of years of evolution, they've figured out these properties that water has, and they've figured out a way to construct their cells to take advantage of the properties of water. So they've got these itsy bitsy little tubes that go all the way up from a fine root hair into the leaves. So we're going to do just a little imagination exercise. Think about the tallest tree you've ever seen. Okay. You got it in your head? The tallest tree you've ever seen? There's some really tall, I mean, it's impressive even if you think of the shortest tree you've ever seen, if you ask me. Think of the tallest tree you've ever seen. That tree, what you see above ground, that tree has the same amount of biomass, the same amount of body underground as it has above ground. It's usually in a different shape. It's a lot more, spreads out a lot more laterally. You know, it doesn't go as far down as the tree goes up, but there's the same amount of biomass underneath the ground as there is above the ground. And there is in that tree, so now you can basically in your mind think of the tallest tree you've ever seen and then double that height. In that, from a fine root hair in the ground, there is a continuous tube, a continuous vessel that goes all the way from that fine root hair in the ground, all the way up to the very tippy top of that tree and into a vein in a leaf at the very top of that tree. This is hard. I talk with my hands a lot and my hands don't show in the Zoom video. But imagine a single continuous uninterrupted vessel of water going from the very, very bottom of the root system of that tree all the way to the very, very top leaf in the foliage of that tree. There is an uninterrupted tube of water that is so tiny around that the water moves up that vessel from the roots into the leaves only through capillary action. Trees do not have a heart. There is no pumping system within a tree to make, there's no pump within a tree to make us, oh, I need to make this slideshow. Okay, there's no pump within a tree to make water move. All water movement within trees is passive. Those little water molecules go where they want to go, and the tree steers them to where it wants the water to go by making these vessels so teeny tiny that the water is compelled to travel up to the top of the tree. Okay, a tree can drag water molecules from one place to another by moving solutes across cell membranes, and then osmosis. So a tree can move like a potassium ion. That's usually what they use to move water back and forth. They'll move a potassium ion, and one potassium ion moved across a cell membrane can drag up to 260 water molecules behind it just through osmosis. That process takes a long time and isn't it's not a viable means for a tree to be able to pump water all the way up from its roots into the top of the leaves. It's just a tree is able to move water. That's still considered passive movement, but a tree is able to kind of force water to move a small way by dragging ions. But the flow of water from the roots up to the leaves is a completely passive event. There is no such thing as a pump within the tree, okay? So it's really important that when we want to understand sort of the difficulty that a tree would have surviving the winter, it's really important to understand the fact that a tree has no way to pump water up to its leaves. It only has these itty bitty teeny tiny vessels that take advantage of the cohesion and adhesion properties of water. Okay. Everybody still with us? Unmute if you're not. I can't see everybody.
Doing great. I'm excited.
Okay, cool. All right. So when the tree is operating during the summer, here we've got a picture of a cross section of a branch or a trunk. I don't know, I found it on Google Images. But we've got a cross section of the branch or trunk of a tree. Inside of those growth rings, we know that each growth ring, or we should know that each growth ring that we see in a tree represents 1 year of growth, right? The usable part of that trunk, the part of that tree trunk that is able to transport water up to the branches or the leaves of the tree, is only the last, if the tree is lucky, 3 to 5 years of rings. The only 3 to 5 years, I've indicated it here with a little green line to show you that only that little portion of the trunk is actually capable of transporting water at any one time. And if it's been a hard couple of years, it might actually be only last year's ring of growth that the tree is able to rely on. We'll talk, you'll be able to figure out why by the end of the time that we're talking. During the summer, because the tree only can move water through capillary action, the leaves of that tree are constantly losing water vapor, because that column of water, a part of the rules of water and of capillary action is that that column of water can only exist so far above, against the pull of gravity. It can only go so far up into the sky if that column is constantly moving. So the tree needs to be constantly pulling water from the roots, and that water needs to be constantly vaporizing through the holes in the bottom of the leaves into the air to keep that column going, so that the water in the vessels will continue to pull kind of extra water out of the ground and up into the leaves. So in the winter time, everything freezes, especially here in Wisconsin, right? So everything freezes, and that water column just naturally has to stop moving. There's no more leaves for the stomata to open for the water vapor to come out of. And then also most of the water that's available in the ground is frozen. The tree really has no need to photosynthesize because there are no leaves to do the photosynthesizing. So that column of water has to stop. It's not going to be able to move anymore. But the tree cannot allow that column of water to just fall down into the ground, because as we've already discussed, the tree has no heart. There's no pumping mechanism to pull that water back up the next year. So what the tree needs to do is it needs to keep that column of water that's in the trunk intact, so that it's there to start with the next spring, and it needs to keep it still. And it also cannot allow that water to freeze, because what happens to water when it freezes?
It expands,
right? Yeah. So that water is going to expand. And what happens when the water that's inside of a tiny little vessel expands is that vessel is going to have to expand to allow the water to expand. And eventually that vessel is going to burst. It's going to pop open. We call that an embolism, which means that inside of our long continuous column of water, we now have an air pocket that's introduced. Because a tree has no heart, it's unable to pump out that air pocket. And any vessel that is broken, that has an embolism, is now useless to the tree. And we know that only 3 to 5 years of the growth rings within the trunk are usable to the tree. So if we accidentally pop all of the vessels within this 3 to 5 years of growth, then we're sunk. The tree itself is going to die. So the tree really, really needs to keep those vessels intact, and it also needs to keep that water sort of in the tree and try to keep it from freezing, even when it gets down to negative 20 degrees, which is like a crazy thing to undertake. I love thinking about this. So the first thing that the tree does to sort of prepare for winter is that when we look really, really close at this cross section, if we only look at this cross section you know, through a microscope, and we're only going to look at the last sort of years of growth, we're going to see this top line. So you can see this early wood, those are vessels that are put down in the springtime. This here is actually we're looking at a cross section of some type of conifer, a softwood, but it doesn't matter. Conifers and angiosperms trees survive the winter the same way. So so in the spring, where we see this early wood, we see that those vessels are much larger, right? The water is pumping up those vessels. It's going fast, and it needs to get up to the top of the tree so that we can make our big flush of growth, so that we can have a ton of leaves, so that we can photosynthesize. But then later in the season, once it's fall, then the tree, when it's putting on new growth, it puts on what's called late wood. And you can see comparatively, those late wood vessels are teeny tiny. They're just these itsy bitsy little things where the water, because it has that really strong cohesion and adhesion properties, that water is stuck so tight into those vessels because it's attracted to the surface, right, of the inside of the vessel, and also to other water molecules. So the first thing that the tree does is that it lays down in fall these late wood vessels that are much smaller, and because they're much smaller, they're much harder to embolize. It would be much harder to break that column of water so that an air bubble could get in there. Trees do sometimes just naturally get embolisms within, you know, very, very small little bubbles of water within their vessels. If that bubble of water is small enough that it doesn't take up the entire inside of the vessel, the tree is able to get rid of that embolism through that solute dragging thing that we talked about before. So a tree would be able to get rid of a teeny tiny embolism by dragging ions from one side of a cell membrane to another and dragging water along with it to sort of get that movement going. And then that embolism can travel up and exit the top of the tree. But in the winter time, because everything's pretty frozen, when we get an embolism in winter time, we don't have the ability to be dragging solutes places and pumping water up. So an embolism that happens in winter time is a ruined vessel, and that vessel's not going to be able to be used in the springtime to bring water up for our initial flush of leafy growth. Okay. So the tree creates these really tiny late wood vessels in the fall to get ready for winter. When we look at the rings of growth on a tree, the dark brown thing that we call the rings, that's the late wood. It looks darker because it's got such tiny little vessels that it's more cell wall than it is empty space. The early wood is sort of the light cream color that you see, and that looks lighter because it's more empty space than it is cell wall. So here is, ooh, that's blurry. Sorry, guys. So here's a cross section of a pin oak branch, which is what they call a ring porous tree. But here you can see that the early wood vessels that were laid down in spring have these big, huge holes that are visible to the naked eye. But these late wood vessels that were laid down in the fall, those vessels are so small that you can't see them with the naked eye. It just looks like solid wood, right? So those late wood vessels are what the tree is going to survive through the winter with. Often these early wood vessels, the tree is just gonna, it already knows. I personify trees a lot. They're not sentient. It doesn't really know a whole lot, but this is how I talk about it. So I hope that's okay. The tree already knows that early wood vessel is too big around to be able to hold water in it for the winter time. So what they do is, I don't have a slide about this, but what they'll do is they'll pump sort of a membranous material called a tyloses, T-Y-L-O-S-E. And then if it's plural, it's tyloses, so you'd put an S on there. So it's Tyloses. The tree will pump membranous material into these big early wood vessels. That membranous material will block off the vessel and it will harden. So those early wood vessels just are no longer going to be used by the tree, and it's going to survive the winter and operate the next spring with the water that's kept in situ in the late wood vessels that were laid down this year. Okay. So here's a very, very simple picture of the vessel, right? The little tube that we've got going up our tree. The green, what is that, a hexagon or an octagon? The green octagon that's there that represents the cell wall, right? And then the orange circle that's inside of the green octagon, that represents the membrane that's inside of the cell wall, okay? So we've got the green cell wall and we've got the orange cell membrane. And inside of that vessel, sort of always pumping up, is water, and then there's solutes in there. So there's carbohydrates, there's sugars, depending on what cell we're talking about. Or there could be, there could also be like mitochondria in there and some cytoplasm. And so there's water plus a bunch of other stuff inside of that cell membrane, okay? So the tree does not want that water to be able to freeze, because when it freezes, it'll expand and it'll crack open that cell membrane and even the cell wall, introducing an embolism. So what the tree is going to do is it's going to sort of disconnect, it's going to unglue the cell membrane from the cell wall. That cell membrane is going to kind of accordion in so that there is space in between the cell wall and the cell membrane. So now we've got kind of two pockets of space, right? And it would be, this is my amazing PowerPoint art here. So now we've got inside of our cell, we've got that cell wall, which is rigid, that stays forever. And then we've got that cell membrane, which the tree has accordioned in to be smaller and leave a lot of space around that cell membrane. The tree is going to take all of the solutes that are inside of that cell and keep it in that now smaller space of the cell membrane. And it's going to pump as much of the water inside of that cell membrane as it can through these little holes that are called aquaporins, which allow water to pass through. It's going to pump as much, and also by doing the ion movement, it's going to get as much water as it can into the space in between the cell membrane and the cell wall. A lot of water also can be pumped into intracellular places, into the places in between the cells. So water will either go all the way outside of the cell wall into a spot in between the cells, or it'll go here in the space that I've shown. So the water is out here, the solutes are in here. With me? Those solutes, there's such a high concentration because the area of that cell membrane is smaller. There's such a high concentration of sugars, carbohydrates, little nutrient molecules like nitrogen, etc. There's such a high concentration of solutes inside of that cell membrane that those solutes are actually going to act as an antifreeze. That water inside of the cell membrane is so filled with other stuff that it lowers the freezing temperature of the water inside of the cell membrane, okay? So it acts as a natural antifreeze. Then outside of the cell membrane, we have most of the water that used to be inside of the cell. And the key thing that we need to know about that water outside of the cell membrane is that it is pure water. It's H's and O's and nothing else, okay? So pure water is inside, is in that place that's in between the cell membrane and the cell wall. Why that matters is that we need to know one more special thing about water on Earth. We've all seen this before when we're walking around. Ice forming, and it always forms on the side of the lake first, right? So if you walk along a pond or a lake, on the side of the lake, we'll see ice forming, and that ice eventually travels in to cover the pond or the lake, right? Or the river or whatever body of water we're talking about. Ice always forms around a molecule or an object that is a non-water thing, okay? Ice always has to have some piece of something that is not water for that first water molecule to hold on to and ice to form and other ice crystals to become attracted to that ice crystal and freeze along with it. Okay, so in this picture, we see all the way on the left-hand side, we see the shore with some sticks in there. Ice is forming along that, using that non-water surface to form on, and then ice forms along or going in towards the open water, and new ice forms on top of the old ice, which was forming on top of a non-water item. Yeah? Okay, so we know that inside of here, we have only water. There is no non-water molecule for ice to form around. When we have no non-water molecule for ice to form around, water, the freezing point of water changes from 32 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Water undergoes a process called supercooling. If you have pure water, only H's and O's, and there's no molecule of anything else, there's no salt molecule, no sugar, no little sodium ion or whatever, then water will stay liquid all the way down to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which also happens to be negative 40 degrees Celsius. So the water that's in between the cell membrane and the cell wall will not freeze. It will stay liquid water until that temperature gets down to negative 40 degrees, which in Wisconsin, at least, almost never happens. Trees, by the way, only ever, like, you know how when you watch the news and it'll tell you, okay, the temperature outside is 0, but the real feel is negative 20. A tree only actually experiences the actual temperature. Trees don't experience wind chill. So the actual temperature outside would need to be negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit for the water inside of that area there, in between the cell membrane and the cell wall. The actual temperature would need to be negative 40 degrees for that water to freeze, which I love imagining. Next time you guys go walk out in the forest in the winter time, imagine not only that the trees that you're looking at have that continuous vessel that goes all the way from their fine root into the ground, all the way up into that tippy-toppy most branch. Not only is there a continuous column of water that goes all that way, but there's also, right now, you go walk around and it's freezing out, or in February, you'll go walk around and it's even freezing or out. There is a liquid water column still continuing from the very bottom of those roots all the way to the top of that tree. It never freezes because it never gets cold enough here for that pure super cooled water to actually freeze. Now, is that bonkers or what? I just think that's so cool. Okay, so inside of our cell membrane, the solutes that are in there act as a natural antifreeze. Outside, we have pure water. there is still a chance that if the tree happens to do something wrong, there could be ice crystals formed both inside of this area where we have our solutes acting as a natural antifreeze. Pretend in one area there's not enough solutes and the freezing point is raised a little bit. There could be some ice crystals that form in there. Same thing in this outer area where we have pure water, there might be an ice crystal that would form because, geez, maybe the tree accidentally left a little molecule of something out in that outer area. So the ice crystals that form there, I've indicated those with a triangle because ice crystals, when they form, have sharp edges. Well, the trees figured out something to help itself out with that. Those ice crystals that have the sharp edges, while this water is pure enough, even if there was one molecule, that water is still pure enough that if ice crystals formed, they're totally unstable. They become ice and then they melt and then they become ice and then they melt. They're kind of constantly shifting around because there's not enough non-water molecules for ice to really form, right? So it's still liquid water. If ice does form, a little bitty small thing of ice forming, it's got those sharp edges, and there's still a chance that as it's sort of floating around in the super cooled water, that sharp ice crystal could smack up against that cell membrane and could pierce that cell membrane, thereby introducing an embolism, or the water would rush back in there and it would freeze and an embolism would happen. So what the tree does is it creates these antifreeze proteins that it just has stored inside of the cell membrane at all times. There's antifreeze proteins that can move in and out of the cell membrane as needed during the winter time. These antifreeze proteins have it's like a little protein that has a hydrophobic cap on it. And that hydrophobic cap goes onto the sharp corners of the ice molecule and basically kind of rounds them off. And it makes it so that it creates kind of a little protective barrier. It like child-proofs the ice molecule, so that now instead of sharp corners, the ice crystal has rounded corners. So that ice crystal can kind of move around and it can hit up against whatever it wants to hit up against, but it's no longer a sharp edge, so that when it hits up against that cell membrane, it will pierce it. So these antifreeze proteins, they have this hydrophobic ice binding face is what they call it. So the one side of that protein binds onto the ice, and then the other side of it is hydrophobic, which means that other water molecules won't be attracted anymore to that little piece of ice to form their own ice crystals onto that, right? So now it is a little ice crystal floating around with no longer sharp edges, and it's covered by hydrophobic proteins, which mean that other water molecules won't be able to glom onto it to make more ice. It's cool enough. It's cool enough that that ice, when it does form, is not in a stable state, like I said. So ice will form, it'll become liquid again, it'll become ice again, it'll become liquid again. But it would be ice for a nanosecond, or a couple seconds at most. It's sort of constantly shifting and changing. But the main thing that a tree does is that it has taken advantage of the properties of water on Earth. It's learned how water operates on Earth, and it's figured out a way to get around the fact that ice expands by separating the water and the solutes enough that our freezing temperature is lowered all the way down to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is also -40 degrees Celsius. So if we think about a very, very tall mountain where there's a tree line at the top of it, or if we think about the globe where there's a tree line, in the Arctic where trees don't grow above that, those lines that we're seeing are the line where sometimes it gets below -40 degrees. That's why trees don't grow there. And that's the only reason really that why trees don't grow past those tree lines, either on mountains or latitudinally, you know what I'm talking about, on the earth. So that's the story, negative 40 degrees. So let me see, I'm going to stop sharing. So conifers, there is a, conifers keep their leaves on all winter long. And a lot of times people think or say that conifers keep their leaves on because they continue to photosynthesize all winter long. And that is just simply not true. Conifers undergo this exact same process as the angiosperms do. They undergo that exact same separating the water from the solutes, keeping the water really well kept away from everything else so that it doesn't freeze, which makes photosynthesis, even if we have our leaves on, photosynthesis is impossible because we can't transport water up and down because the water is not actually inside of the cell membrane of the vessel. It's in between the cell membrane and the cell wall. So conifers, their big advantage that they get from being evergreen is a week or two on either side of the growing season. Because they already have their leaves on, they are able to undo these winter processes a few weeks earlier than deciduous trees are. And they're able to start photosynthesizing right away when it's still, you know, before leaf breakout, but when there's still liquid water in the world. So conifers do not photosynthesize during the winter time. They're like, the reason that they're evergreen is because they live in a cold enough area that they want to extend their growing season 2 or 3 weeks on this side and 2 or 3 weeks on this side. But during the winter, after we've undergone this cold hardening process, if we undo that cold hardening process, we can't redo it in the span of an hour or so. So if there's just like, there's a lot of people that think that if it's kind of a warm winter day, a pine tree will photosynthesize. That is not true. A pine tree will start to photosynthesize once it senses that days are getting long enough that it's safe to undo those cold hardening processes. It will begin to photosynthesize and it will continue all the way through till the end of fall. And then once it senses that days are now short enough that it's no longer sort of safe to be transporting water up and down, they will go to bed, and they go to bed for the entire winter. So that's a husband's tale.
Caitlin, we have a question kind of relating to that was asked a little bit ago about, is there a specific month or months that late wood develops? I'm sure that applies to both, yeah, maybe to the fall, but I guess when it undevelops in springtime too.
Yeah,
and I'm sure it depends on where you are in Wisconsin or in Florida or wherever. So.
Yeah, it depends where you are, what species you are, and also what this year has been like. So I would say on average in Wisconsin, if you're looking at a tree, they start to develop because they're awfully conservative guys, because they live here in Wisconsin, right, where things can be unpredictable. They are, trees are amazing cost benefit analyzers. They've decided exactly when the cost outweighs the benefit, and they will cut off photosynthesis and they will start their cold hardening process. But I would say that probably by late August, even though it's really still warm to us, by late August, the days are no longer getting longer, and they start getting shorter. And so the tree won't start cold hardening until, maybe October or November, when you see the leaves starting to fall. Late September, October, when leaves are really falling off of the tree, that's when we do our cold hardening. But they'll start laying down their late wood quite a bit before that, like in August or even late July, because they need quite a bit of time to get ready for winter.
Sure, and it seems like there's another question too about the opposite of this process. What happens when the sap starts running in maple trees? And how do trees sense daylight or day length?
Okay, so I'm going to answer the how do trees sense day length thing first. So inside of a tree, there's all kinds of hormones, and the one that we care about when it comes to day length and night length, really what they're keeping track of, we call it, because we are diurnal animals, we call it day length. But what trees are actually tracking is how long the night is. So trees have a hormone inside of them called ethylene. I'm sure you've heard of ethylene before. It's a plant hormone that farmers use, for example, to make their crops ripen faster, or like if they pick a bunch of apples while they're still green, they'll put them in a warehouse where they pump ethylene in, and that will make the apples ripen and turn red. So ethylene has a few jobs within a tree. One of the big ones is seed ripening and fruit ripening for reproduction. And the other big job that ethylene has is that it helps the tree sense night length. Ethylene inside of a plant is being constantly created. It's constantly being created within that plant, and it's a volatile hormone. So it is made in a liquid form, and then it volatilizes and it becomes gas. So ethylene is constantly being created within a tree, but it's constantly being let out through those holes that are on the bottom of the leaf called stoma. So those stomata, they'll open, and then the ethylene comes out. And during the daytime, the tree's always producing ethylene, and the ethylene is always escaping through those leaves. In the nighttime, those stomata underneath the leaf close up. So ethylene is still being created within that tree, but it's not being let go through the leaves. So the tree will sense how much ethylene builds up. The length of the night means that more ethylene builds up in that night. The tree, it's amazing how something that has no central nervous system has a memory. It's unexplainable to us humans so far, but the tree has basically a memory of how much ethylene has been building up last night and the night before it and the night before it. And when it discovers, oh geez, I'm building up less ethylene now than I did the last 5 nights in a row, then it knows that the days, well, if it's building up less, then it knows that the days are getting longer. When it notices, oh, I'm building up a lot of ethylene compared to last night, or on average, the last week of nights, it knows that days are getting shorter and nights are getting longer. And then that's what sets the getting ready for winter physiological processes in motion. When the sap starts running in maple trees is a great question that I knew that I would get. And the answer is that if you would like to change your career and become a tree physiologist, there is an amazing discovery that you can make, and you can be the person whose name gets on the fact that you were the guy that understood exactly what's happening in sap flow in maple trees in the springtime. The real answer is that we don't understand it yet. We don't understand how sap flow can be so aggressive and so active when it is when nights are still freezing and days are above freezing, how that gets going so quickly, and how it can start moving, especially seeing as the tree has no leaves for those stomata to be opening, to be able to carry that that column of water up into the air. So the quick answer is, I don't know that answer because people don't know that answer. The long answer is that in the springtime, there is, even though it seems very cold to us, underneath a certain layer of the ground, sugar maples are pretty deep-rooted plants. There's a depth of the ground where under that there is liquid water available. So they are taking up liquid water, and sugar maples do have on their on their twigs, on the wood of their twigs, there's these little bitty holes that you can see if you look at them. They've got sort of a brown copper colored twig that has little white spots all over it. And those little white spots are called lenticels. Those lenticels are gas exchange holes. Those lenticels have been shown in some studies to be sort of taking over the airflow job that a leaf would normally do in the springtime. So while a leaf would normally be the output of the water vapor in the summertime, in a sugar maple, what people think is that a lenticel takes over that job of being where water vapor can go so that the water column, the sap column, can still move. I see a note from Tim that Danny Pirtle has an excellent podcast on maple syrup. So check that out. Maybe he's found something more that I don't know. But an educator recently asked me to look up and explain to them how sap flow goes in maple trees. And I got both very excited and very frustrated trying to find the answer. So if anybody wants a new career, you can study that when you get your new PhD.
Caitlin, I don't think they explain it like I think it's more like, and then magic happens, and then. Oh. But it's a good podcast.
According to us. Yeah, and the fact that things are explainable by science, I would like to say, does not make them any less magical. I mean, I think this whole thing is absolutely magical. It's totally explainable, but totally magical. And what an amazing thing that such a clever, I mean, these adaptations that we're talking about are clever. I mean, they're smart. I couldn't in a million years think, all right, I would get around the properties of water by doing this, or I would get around the properties of water by doing this. It kind of shows the power of millions and millions of years of infinite chance to figure out just this really cool adaptation to survive the winter. The other thing that is kind of interesting about this is that while surviving the winter seems to be, and definitely is, hard work for trees, it's also a pretty necessary break for them. Just like we as humans need to lay down every night and have 8 hours of sleep, or according to our doctors, we need to have even more of that. Just like we need sleep every night, the tree needs to have a dormant season every year. The summertime, when it's photosynthesizing, that is a crazy time of year for the tree. It is working as hard as it can to back up all of the processes that are happening in the leaf of the tree. It's got those chlorophyll in there, and those chlorophyll are such excitable little molecules that when they are being hit by photons of light, they cannot help but photosynthesize. So they're photosynthesizing, which obligates the tree to do a lot of backup work. So the tree needs that little bit of rest time in the winter. And studies have been done on trees that normally live in an area like Wisconsin, where we have a winter and we have a dormant period. Trees that are normally outside have been brought in and cared for, just the way that they would be outside, except for they have not been given the freezing temperatures and the lowering day length to make them go into their yearly dormancy. And that study showed that after 2 years, so 2 full growing seasons of not allowing dormancy, 100% of the trees in the study died. So even though it's really, really hard work to survive the winter, it is a necessary rest for the tree. If you look at trees that grow on the equator, where day length and night length doesn't change as crazy as it does up here, trees will just sort of randomly, well, it's certainly not random, but I don't know what they're acting on, but trees will go dormant for a couple months, just kind of on their own. And it doesn't seem to be, you know, it may be during the drought season, they'll go dormant. But even trees that have no winter go through a dormancy period. We all need sleep, and trees are no different.
Wow, that was truly fascinating. Thank you, everyone, for attending Dendrology 799. Your thesis is due in an hour. But I think everyone is fascinated, and that was very clear and very well done. So thank you, Caitlin. We have a few minutes now for questions. Please ask them now. And again, as I said before, we'll be continuing this discussion on YouTube Live at 10:15 in 15 minutes. So there's a lot to talk about. We could be talking about this for another few hours. But please, if you have any burning questions, please ask them now. Go ahead and unmute yourself or type them in the chat.
I don't have any burning questions, but I think I have a burning need to say, wow, that was amazing. That was such an incredible talk. I learned so much that I never knew before.
Well, good.
And your presentation was just so engaging. Thank you so much.
Oh, gee, thank you. I do teach I guess I should do a little plug here. I do teach a tree physiology class through Urban Ecology Center. It's a college level course, I like to call it, like what we just did. I would call that college level. It's a college level course, but we only cover the fun stuff. We ignore all the boring stuff. It's a 6-session class. I do plan on teaching it this winter over Zoom or Google Classrooms or something like that. I'm actually trying to put together my plan now. I don't know exactly when it'll be, but keep checking back at the Urban Ecology Center website for that. And if you'd be interested, we'll cover trees in winter, we'll cover tree hormones, we'll cover embryogenesis and reproduction. And, you know, tree physiology is a fascinating science. And,
Yeah.
And so I hope you'll consider joining that class.
I have a question that's probably can't be answered in a very short few minute and a half. I learned in high school biology something about xylem and phloem. And what I would like to know is how what you've talked about relates to the movement of whatever it gets moved in the xylem and phloem in trees.
Yeah, so the vessels that I was talking about, I was talking pretty much mostly about those xylem and phloem vessels. So they undergo that exact process that we talked about. The xylem, for anybody who needs a little review, the xylem are those, let me share this screen so we can go back to the picture of the cross section. Okay. So the xylem are all of these, there's that real dark line that goes around, right? And the xylem are all those vessels inside of that. This is all xylem. Xylem carries water and nutrients from the ground up into the leaves. Phloem, flow, I always think phloem, water flows down. Phloem brings not usually water, but sugars and photosynthates from the leaf back down to the roots to feed the roots. So both the xylem and phloem will undergo these this sort of crunching up of the cell membrane and the separation of water from the solutes. And the phloem, because it is farther on the outside of the tree, that phloem is in a way riskier position than the xylem is. But because the xylem is the stuff that's responsible for taking water up to the top of the tree knows that really that's what's worth protecting in the winter time. Because in spring, when we start growing again, the first step is to get water up to where our leaves are starting to bud out. We can deal with stuff getting down afterwards, but the first thing we need to do is get water up to those little budding leaves, right? So the xylem is inside, it's a little bit more protected, and that xylem is really what the tree makes a big effort to keep surviving through the winter time. A lot of those phloem cells will embolize and will die just because of the fact that they're at the edge of the tree. You know, some little mouse comes and gnaws on it, or a buck does a buck rub, and those xylem cells are gone. So they have thinner cell walls and are more easily replaceable from the tree. And because the water in those phloem cells is going down, we don't really need to worry about continuing that tube as much as we do in the ones that are going up, because the ones that are going up, that's where we need our capillary action to stay intact at all times. Where the ones that are going down, I mean, the water's going to flow down no matter what. So we can easily recreate those cells, and we don't need to worry about there being sort of constantly water in them because we have no pump. The water will naturally fall down those new cells next spring.
Thanks.
It's just so cool to hear about the complexities. And, you know, Caitlin says they're not a sentient being, but through millions of years of evolution, you have to kind of treat it as if it were one. And, you know, what some of the stuff that we've been learning about the mycorrhizae and the connections between trees, even of different species, that complexity just in a forest is so, you know, just you see a tree is a tree, but there's so much more to it, you know.
Yeah, it's really, really cool. And I've had people ask me before, like, well, we're still discovering things about trees. You know, they might discover that there is a central nervous system in a tree, and they do think about stuff. And my honest answer is that would bum me out. I think it is so much cooler, the idea that the infinite chance on Earth is what's smart, instead of this one being a genius. You know, I think it's just infinitely cooler that evolution by chance would get us to this amazing place than it is that somebody thought it through and figured it out. But that's just me.